Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on something, well, a tactic, I guess, as old as power itself, really. Using violence to get power and then keep it.
Yeah, it's a tale of two revolutions, really, when you think about it. We're going to be looking at two very different leaders, Hitler and Castro,
Right.
who use violence in strikingly similar ways.
And you sent this over. This is fascinating. This podcast, Mr. Hutchings History. Did you listen to this whole thing?
Yeah, I listened to the whole thing. It's really good.
Okay, so it compares Hitler's Night of the Long Knives
Yeah.
to the aftermath of Castro's Cuban Revolution.
Right.
Two different continents, two different ideologies, but some chilling common ground.
Well, that's what's so fascinating about this is that we often study these regimes in isolation, but when you put them side by side like this, it reveals a lot about how power dynamics play out regardless of the political system. You
Right.
know,
Yeah, let's unpack it.
common threads there.
First up, Hitler's Germany. For those who maybe need a refresher, paint us a picture of Germany in the 1930s.
So imagine Germany between the world wars. You've got economic turmoil, political instability. It's a nation that's still reeling from its defeat in World War I.
Right.
And this is where Hitler and his Nazi party enter the scene.
And they weren't exactly a political party just like handing out pamphlets, right? They
Yeah.
had the SA, the brown shirts.
Yeah.
What were they all about?
So the Sturmabteilung, or SA,
Yeah.
were essentially Hitler's street fighters. Millions of them at their peak.
Wow.
Initially, they were crucial for intimidating opponents, breaking up rallies, basically creating this atmosphere of fear that helped the Nazi party rise to power.
So they were like thugs for hire.
Yeah, kind of more like paramilitary revolutionaries. They saw themselves as the tip of the spear for a new Germany.
Okay.
But their leader, Ernst Röhm, had ambitions that went far beyond being Hitler's attack dog.
This is where it gets interesting. So the podcast mentioned this whole second revolution thing.
Yes.
What was that all about?
So Röhm envisioned a second revolution to radicalize the Nazi movement even further. He was pushing for a more socialist, even more violent transformation of Germany.
Oh, wow.
He wanted to absorb the regular army into the SA, which terrified the traditional military leaders.
And Hitler needed the army on his side, right?
All
If
right.
he was going to go on to try to conquer Europe, he needed the army, not just street thugs.
Exactly. Röhm had become a liability, a threat to Hitler's larger ambitions. Whether or not Hitler truly believed it, Röhm's enemies within the Nazi party were all too happy to fabricate evidence of a planned SA coup against the government.
And then comes the Night of the Long Knives. Give us the rundown.
June 30th, 1934, Hitler, using that fabricated coup as a pretext, unleashes the SS,
Right.
his elite guard, to purge the SA leadership. Röhm is arrested and executed without trial, along with dozens of other high-ranking SA members.
It's chilling how calculated it all seems. Like
Yeah.
this was the plan all along.
Yeah.
You know. The podcast also mentioned that it wasn't just about the SA. It was a strategic play for absolute power.
Absolutely. Hitler used this purge to eliminate other perceived rivals as well, consolidating his grip on power. People like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who was seen as a potential threat, were also targeted and killed.
Wow.
It was a brutal message. No one was safe if they challenged Hitler's authority.
Out with the old, in with the new. And by new, we mean the SS.
Exactly. With the SA effectively decapitated, the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, they step into the void.
Right.
They become Hitler's primary instrument of terror and control. Their ruthlessness becomes a hallmark of the Nazi regime.
Okay, so we've got one flavor of violence used to consolidate power in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears to Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Totally different context, right?
Very different. It's 1959, and Castro's revolutionaries, after years of guerrilla warfare, finally overthrow the corrupt and oppressive Batista regime.
Right.
And there's this initial wave of euphoria,
Yeah.
widespread support for Castro. But things change very, very quickly.
The podcast was pretty clear about that point, that Castro wasted no time in consolidating his power.
Absolutely.
But he did it very publicly,
Yeah.
right? Show trials, executions.
Exactly. Unlike Hitler's more secretive purge, Castro used the spectacle of revolutionary justice to solidify his regime. Hundreds of Batista officials and supporters were subjected to these show trials, often with predetermined guilty verdicts.
Which brings us to that chilling quote from Castro that really stuck with me. Revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but on moral conviction.
Yeah.
I mean, that sends shivers down your spine. What do you make of that?
It's chilling, no doubt about it, and it really gets to the heart of how Castro justified his use of violence.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about eliminating enemies. It was about moral cleansing, a purging of the old order. He was creating a new Cuba, and anyone deemed an obstacle to that vision was expendable.
It's interesting, though, because the podcast also highlighted this other tactic Castro used that was very different from Hitler.
Yeah.
Exile.
Right.
He wasn't just killing everyone who disagreed with him.
Right. And that's a crucial point. While Hitler sought to eliminate opposition entirely, Castro recognized the strategic advantage of allowing dissenters an escape valve.
You mean get out or face the consequences?
Exactly. It served two purposes. It removed potential troublemakers from within Cuba, and it sent a chilling message to those who remained. Toe the line or face the same fate.
And the podcast mentioned the Mariel boat lift in 1980. Over 100,000 Cubans fled to the United States.
Right.
That must have had a huge impact on Cuban society.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine the brain drain, the families torn apart.
Yeah.
And while it's true that many who left were opposed to Castro's regime, there were also countless others who simply saw no future for themselves or their families in Cuba.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a different kind of consequence,
Yeah.
but a consequence nonetheless.
Precisely. And it speaks to the long-term impact of these regimes built on violence.
Right.
Even if the violence isn't always overt, the threat of it, the fear, it lingers.
Yeah, it's like this dark cloud hanging over everything.
Exactly. But let's get back to the comparison with Hitler.
Both used violence, but in such different ways.
Right.
Hitler's purge was this very calculated behind-the-scenes maneuver. Castro made it a public spectacle.
And their objectives were different too, right? Hitler eliminating rivals within his own movement.
Right.
Castro targeting the remnants of the Batista regime.
Precisely. For Hitler, it was about consolidating his personal power within the Nazi Party.
Right.
For Castro, it was about making an example of the old guard, sending a message that the old ways were over.
But both used fear to control their people, didn't they?
Absolutely. Fear was a tool in both their arsenals. In Nazi Germany, it was systematic, pervasive, fueled by the propaganda machine and enforced by the SS and the Gestapo.
Right.
It was about controlling every aspect of people's lives, from their thoughts to their actions.
And ultimately, it paved the way for the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of millions of Jews and other minorities.
A horrifying testament to the dangers of unchecked power and state-sanctioned violence.
In Cuba, it seems like the violence, while brutal, never reached that same level of genocide. That's a crucial distinction. While Castro's regime was undoubtedly authoritarian and oppressive, it never descended into the same depths of systematic genocide as Nazi Germany. There were no death camps in Cuba.
Right.
Yeah.
So different flavors of authoritarianism, but both built on a foundation of violence.
Yeah.
What about the long-term impact? How did this use of violence shape their regimes in the years that followed?
For Hitler, the Night of the Long Knives was a turning point. It eliminated his rivals, solidified his control over the Nazi Party, and paved the way for the totalitarian state that Germany would become.
Right.
The violence, instead of subsiding, only escalated in the years that followed.
And for Castro, what was the legacy of his brand of revolutionary justice?
Well, the violence in Cuba, it definitely helped solidify Castro's grip on power in those early years, eliminated immediate threats, instilled a level of fear that made open opposition incredibly risky.
Right.
But it also had lasting consequences for Cuban society, you know.
The podcast mentioned historians have all these different ways of looking at it. Hitler and Castro, their tactics, the long-term effects. It's not all cut and dry, is it?
Oh, rarely is. Historians have debated this for decades, you know. Some, what they call the totalitarian school, see both Hitler and Castro as textbook examples of totalitarian leaders.
Right.
They argue that violence is inherent to these types of regimes. You know, it's a tool for crushing dissent and establishing absolute control.
So from that perspective, it's all about control, control, control. Ends justify the means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have the structuralist perspective, right?
Right.
They'd argue that the violence was a response to specific pressures. For Hitler, it was rum and the SA threatening his relationship with the army, a relationship he needed for his grand ambitions.
Right.
And for Castro, it was about securing the revolution, making sure there was no coming back for Batista supporters.
Less about inherent evil, more like a brutal kind of pragmatism.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Then you have the revisionists. They emphasize the calculated nature of the violence.
Right.
They'd say it wasn't just driven by ideology, but a cold, hard strategy to stabilize their regimes and secure the loyalty of key institutions.
So more Machiavelli than monster.
In a sense, yeah. And then, of course, you have the post-revisionists who take a more nuanced view.
Right.
They acknowledge the complex interplay of ideology and pragmatism.
Yeah.
They'd say it's not either, but rather both.
A little bit of both. ideology shaping their worldview, but also understanding how to play the game of power.
Exactly.
And playing it ruthlessly.
Exactly. It's rarely black and white in history, is it?
Never is. This has been an incredible deep dive, though, I've got to say.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
It's disturbing, for sure, seeing the lengths people will go to for power. But it's also a reminder that these patterns repeat themselves throughout history.
Right.
And we need to be able to recognize them.
I completely agree. The more we understand the nuances of history, the more equipped we are to recognize the warning signs and hopefully prevent such atrocities from happening again.
Well said. Okay, listeners, here's something to ponder as we sign off. We've seen how violence can be a tool for consolidating power. But what are the long-term costs of using such a tool? Does it inevitably lead to more violence and oppression? Or are there examples where it's been used more strategically, with less horrific consequences? Something to think about. Until our next deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.